All right, folks. Well, welcome. Happy Earth Week. Happy day after Earth Day. I hope you all had a lovely day yesterday and got to celebrate. My name is Todd Martin. I'm the Grassroots Outreach Coordinator at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Our topic this morning is how to reduce food waste in our homes with Chrissy Adamowicz, who is NRCM's Sustainable Maine Outreach Coordinator. You'll hear from her in just a moment. But first, just a little background about the Natural Resources Council of Maine and some logistics for how this webinar will run this morning. So NRCM is Maine's largest environmental advocacy organization. We are a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. NRCM was founded in 1959 to protect the Allagash River from development. For more than 60 years, NRCM has been Maine's leading voice in protecting the nature of Maine. And we have 25,000 members and supporters all around the country and here in Maine. So for today's webinar, just a couple of logistics. Your video and audio are turned off by design. You'll only be able to see and hear Chrissy and I. If you have a question for Chrissy or myself, please use the question and answer box located at the bottom of your screen. It's a little Q&A box with a chat box. Feel free to type your questions in there, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer after Chrissy's presentation. And we are recording this webinar, so you're welcome to watch it afterwards at your convenience. So before I pass it off to Chrissy, a little bit about her. So Chrissy, as I mentioned, is NRCM's Sustainable Maine Outreach Coordinator, and she helps communities create policies that are supportive of sustainable living behaviors that protect Maine's environment. She gives presentations, provides information, and creates materials for NRCM's website as a go-to to engage Maine citizens. Prior to working at NRCM, Chrissy promoted sustainability in Androscoggin County through healthy eating and active living initiatives. She has a bachelor's degree in ecology and environmental science and a master's in sustainable communities. Chrissy enjoys the outdoors, travel, art, and daydreaming of car-free communities. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Chrissy.
Thanks, Todd. Just opening my presentation here. Okay. Great. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today on this bright, beautiful, sunny day. We're going to talk today about food waste solutions for Maine households. As Todd said, I'm the Sustainable Maine Outreach Coordinator for NRCM, and so we work with a lot of communities on the issue of food waste and reducing food waste. We have the sector of food waste is pretty big, but today we're going to focus specifically on Maine households because we're all stuck at home right now. So it's a good time to think about our food waste and our food habits. So here's just a little overview of what the presentation will cover today. I'm going to go over a little background on food waste so we're all on the same page about what the problem is. And then we'll go into some areas of intervention for households. There will be time for questions and answers at the end. And this presentation is about 30 to 40 minutes. All right, let's dive in. We're going to start by talking about what the problem is. And I wanted to start by providing a definition of what food waste is. So what is it? It's any food that is grown and produced for human consumption, but ultimately is not eaten. As I said earlier, the problem of food waste runs across all sectors. So we've got some photos here of people in a dumpster, presumably from a grocery store with a bunch of food waste. There's a picture of a farm with tomatoes and green beans on it. That produce will be worked into the soil again because that couldn't get to market. And then there's plate waste. And that's really a problem of households, and we'll be talking about that today. Okay, so there are poll questions, and here's our first poll question. How much food waste do you think is being produced in the US? Yeah, 40%. So that's pretty close, or that's right on. You know, your answers are right on. We get 30 and 40% as the highest responses. And that's right. We're wasting almost half of our food. It's pretty shocking. That's about 63 million tons of food waste. That's about 400 pounds per person per year. Agriculture in the US accounts for 80% of freshwater consumption, 10% of energy use, 50% of our land and soil, and we spend $218 billion on growing food that's never eaten. So we have another problem that is part and parcel to food waste. We have a major problem of food insecurity in this country. Food insecurity is defined as chronic uncertainty of when the next meal will be or where it will come from. And unfortunately, 48 million Americans are in this position and are food insecure. And that's about 13.6% of Mainers who are food insecure. That's 1 in 5 Maine children, and unfortunately, Maine ranks 12th in the nation and 1st in New England for food insecurity. There are a lot of really fabulous organizations out there working to solve both problems simultaneously with really very commendable programs. So I just wanted to make a note about that great work and that it's also a problem associated with food waste. All right, so here's a little breakdown about what's being wasted. It's sort of helpful to know that most of the things that are being wasted are perishable items. So 42% of fruits and vegetables, milk and dairy, grain products, meat, seafood, those are all things that are most likely to go to waste. You can see that it's broken down by consumer and retail portions, and that's because the consumer-facing businesses, so like governments, supermarkets, restaurants, schools, other institutions, those are consumer-facing businesses, and they're wasting about 40% of food. And then the households are responsible for 43% of food waste. And when you look at Maine's household trash, about 30% of what's in that bin is food and organic waste. This is pretty consistent with national rates of food waste. So this is specific to Maine, and we're pretty much on par with other places. This is a problem because when all of that waste goes to the landfill, it produces methane gas, which is 25% more potent than a greenhouse gas of carbon dioxide. So, you know, it's a huge problem for climate changing emissions. In fact, if we were able to stop food waste, that's the third most important thing we could do to cut and curb climate changing emissions. Alternatively, if it's not sent to the landfill and it's sent to a waste to energy facility, which is basically an incinerator that recaptures the embodied energy of the waste, it slows that process down because food waste is very wet, and that slows that burning process down and it doesn't reach its full energy recovery potential. And then we're also spending a lot of money sending all this food waste to the landfill because it's very heavy and it costs a lot to transport that food waste. You know, food is about 80% water, and it weighs water weighs 8 pounds, 8 pounds per gallon. So it really adds up to cost us a lot. So here we have another poll question. How long can organic material stay intact when in the landfill? Yeah, so also right on. The food in a landfill, the thing about landfills is they're very spotty. The internal environments has the potential to preserve food and other organic material for a really long time. But that, it's spotty, so there might be parts of the landfill where things are decaying a little faster, but there's a lot of things that are just staying in landfills and not changing at all. So here's some pretty shocking pictures of things that have been mined out of a landfill. At the top there, we've got some 10-year-old mummified carrots. They're still orange on the inside. They snapped when, they broke them, and they're sort of covered in some sort of black toxic material, whatever it is. And then there's a newspaper clipping from 1965 there in the bottom that the University of Washington found. And the way I look at it is that these materials contain natural resources, all of the embodied air and energy and soil that went into growing and producing those natural materials, we're basically locking them away in a landfill. And we shouldn't be doing that, because we have limited natural resources, and we want to make sure they're clean and can be used again in the future by future generations. So keeping these things out of the landfill is really important for that reason too. Okay, so food waste is a big problem. It's on a big scale. It's a very big problem. What can we do in our households to prevent this food waste? Let's start talking about that. So maybe some of you have seen this before. This is the Maine food recovery hierarchy. And there are a lot of hierarchies out there like this. The EPA has one, and it's basically a roadmap to help people understand what they can do before sending waste to a landfill or an incinerator, which is the least desirable option for managing that waste. At the very top, we want to reduce unwanted food waste and unwanted food to begin with. So this diagram has things that institutions can do, but we're going to talk a lot about what we can do in the household to reduce those unwanted food waste. The next most important thing is feeding other people and sharing that food when you can't take it yourself. In these COVID times, if you want to donate to your local food donation center, just make sure you call them first and make sure that you are that you can help them in the best way possible, because it might actually not be food that they need right now. Maybe it's something else altogether. So just call them and have that conversation. You also want to feed animals if you can. Some people have backyard chickens or have pigs, so feed them the unwanted food if you can. And then the other option is to compost or convert to fuel. And we're going to talk a lot about those options today too, because they're easy to do at home, and you don't need a lot of resources to get started. Okay. So from the beginning, when you are going to the grocery store, you want to start by planning your meals if you can. You want to make a checklist of all your weekly meals, because this can help you make sure that your meals are well portioned out, and that you are planning for the right amount of food and not overbuying. When you're making a checklist, think about what your family likes. Think about the time it takes. I know that during a normal work week, we can get really busy, and sometimes we underpredict how much time it can take to make a meal, especially if you're going to try something new. So make sure that you have that time to try something new. If you are going to try something new, make sure you think about a backup meal. So if you are trying cauliflower rice, for example, for the first time, and it might be something that your family likes, it might be something they don't like, we don't really know. What else could you do with that cauliflower if it turns out that people don't like it, or if you don't have time to make it? Think about, could you repurpose it into a soup or something? SaveTheFood.com has a lot of really fantastic resources, especially for meal planning. So I encourage you to check it out. One of my favorite tools of theirs is the Save the Food Guesstimator. It's really cool. It helps you plan for big parties. So if you're planning for a birthday party, you can plug in how many small eaters you're going to have. So maybe you have 10 small eaters because it's a children's party, and it'll help you calculate exactly how much food you would need for that party. Alternatively, if you're going to have a Thanksgiving dinner with all your family members, you can plug in how many people are going to be there, how many eaters are going to be, and then the cool thing is you can plan for how many leftovers you want, which is really cool. The tool also lets you choose the types of foods. So if you're going to have a vegan party, it gives you that option, or you can choose from other more traditional meals. So that's a really fantastic tool that's out there. So you've done your meal planning and you might be at the grocery store now. When you're at the grocery store, keep in mind the reality of date labels. They're not standardized. They're by the FDA, and they're really more about helping grocery store staff understand peak quality, and it's much more about quality than food safety. So keep that in mind. What they mean, you often see the best if used by date label, and that's really about peak quality. It's still good after that date if you still have it, if you haven't gone through it yet. The sell by date you can largely ignore. That's sort of that date's meant to move product on and off the shelves a little more quickly. The freshness is built into a product with the sell by date on it. And then freeze by dates, you can pay attention to those because if you haven't used the food and you've reached the freeze by date, you can put it in the freezer and that'll sort of press the pause button on that food's life and it'll extend the shelf life. There's this thing called the danger zone, and this is really what's important to be aware about. Food can start to go bad between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So even if you just bought it, you just took it out of the refrigerator at the grocery store, if you leave it in your car and it's a warm, sunny day, it could go bad pretty quickly. So it's really about keeping foods out of that zone that'll help preserve them and keep them lasting longer. And then at the end of the day, using your eyes and nose is still the best way to make sure that your foods are safe to eat. So, don't be afraid to smell and taste and just follow your eyes and nose to make sure that those foods are still safe to eat. And then I just wanted to make a shout out because Congresswoman Pingree has actually been a leader of changing the way we do date labels in Washington. So, we're hopeful that we can fix and standardize date labels in the future, and she's really been leading on that, so that's exciting. All right, so you're back at home with all your groceries, you know about date labels. Let's talk about proper food storage. The first thing you want to do is set your refrigerator to 40 degrees or below, because again, we want to avoid that danger zone. And then recognize that the refrigerator has different temperature zones on it. So you've got on the upper shelves, it's a little bit warmer, and on the bottom, it's colder, and that makes sense because cold air falls. The door is actually the warmest part of the refrigerator. So knowing that, you want to put leftovers, drinks, eggs, milk, cheese, bread on the upper shelves. And on the bottom shelf, you want to put meats and seafood, and that's strategic because it's colder, but also because sometimes those products can drip, and you don't want that dripping to hit your other foods. Most refrigerators have a high humidity drawer and a low humidity drawer, and you want to put produce that wilts easily in the high humidity drawer. So things like greens and herbs that are prone to wilting, you want to put in the high humidity drawer because it's moisture in there and it'll keep it rigid longer. The low humidity drawer is good for foods that are a little softer and might get squishy sooner. So berries, maybe apples, tomatoes are good for the low humidity drawer. And then your door is good for things like condiments, drinks, butter, things that have a long natural shelf life and can withstand warmer temperatures. And then one thing that I always do, and it's good to get in the habit of, is just check on your fridge every day. Like, you want to make sure that you are checking in on your foods to make sure that they're not going bad, because then that you can move them up basically in your priority of cooking. So if you've got maybe an apple that's going bad, like I did the other day, I actually just tossed it in with some Brussels sprouts and some onion and my pasta sauce, and it basically disappeared. Like, it didn't change the flavor profile of my sauce, but I was able to save that apple, even though it was grainy and I wouldn't have eaten it otherwise. And then there's some cool tricks that you can use to revive food that's already gone bad. So, you can prevent wilting by putting your greens or celery or other produce in cold water as soon as you get it home. I do that a lot when I come home from the farmer's market with greens. I sort of make a greens bouquet and put it in a glass of water and then stick it in the fridge. But the same trick works if you haven't been able to do that and your food is already wilting. So if you've got wilted celery or wilted greens, stick them in a bin of cold water, and you can stick that bin in your fridge, and in like 5 to 10 minutes, it'll start to perk back up. And the longer that you leave it in there, the more rigid it'll get. If your meal has become too salty, you can dilute with water. You can add vinegar or lemon. Just be a little careful with how much vinegar because it can be really strong. Or you can soak it up with a potato. So just chop up a potato and stick it into the meal. It'll absorb some of the salts, and you can take those potatoes out, save them for later. Maybe make a little breakfast with those potatoes. Maybe some eggs would be good. And that's how you can absorb some of that salt. And then, to prevent a meal from being too salty, just try to pre-measure, add slowly, and taste along the way. That can really help prevent a meal from becoming too salty in the first place. Some foods get stale a little faster than we'd like them to, and the way you can revive that is by toasting for a few minutes and then eating it right away, and it'll be crispy again. To prevent foods from becoming stale, I recommend storing in an airtight container. And then to prevent overcooking foods, sort of like the saltiness, try to test it along the way. If you're prone to overcooking, set a timer. If it's too late, you've already overcooked, you can puree those foods for soups and sauces, which can always be really a good, fun way of trying something new too. And then there are some other tricks that you can use to prevent food waste. Use smaller plates to help keep portions the right size. This is great if, you've got family members whose eyes are definitely bigger than their stomachs. If you put a cup of food on a large dinner plate, it's going to look a lot like a lot less food than if you put it on a smaller, maybe lunch plate. So you can use that visual trick. You can raise the visibility of healthy foods that perish quickly. So maybe it's been a week and you've got apples in your low humidity drawer. You just remembered that they're in there. You've kind of forgotten about them because they were in the fridge. If you take them out, put them on the counter in a decorative bowl or something, then you'll have that visual reminder to eat those foods, and they'll be sort of front and center, and you'll get to you'll be able to remember to eat them. And then you can, for the smaller members of our family, it can take 7 tries of new food before they like it. So that can create a lot of food waste. So there are tricks about, you can use fun and exciting names to help create more of an appeal for those foods. So calling your carrots X-ray vision carrots, or again, maybe something like fluffy cauliflower rice if your child likes fluffy foods. If your child likes creamy foods, you could say, creamy mashed potatoes. That sort of language can help stir their appetite and help prevent that food waste. And just one thing to note: these tricks are good for, kids don't always dislike foods because of flavor. Sometimes it's a texture thing. So if you can call out the texture that they prefer, that can help get those foods eaten and prevent that waste. So those are some tricks for preventing it in the first place, but we all end up with food waste and scraps. So let's talk about what to do with those wastes once you've got them. All right, so we've got another poll question. Which method do you use at home? All right, great. So a lot of you are already composting in your backyard. That's really cool. I hope that you learned some new tricks today from this presentation. And then another big portion of you are not currently composting. So I also hope that you learn a little bit about it. And, you know, NRCM is always a resource for you. So let's get started on talking about home composting and starting in the kitchen, because that's where it all begins. So the first thing you want to do is you want to choose a small bucket. 1 to 3 gallons is what I find to be a good size. You can buy composting buckets. Some of them are stainless steel and they've got a nice filter in them to keep smell down. But I use actually just like a paint bucket from the hardware store, and I find that works just fine. And then you want to fill your bucket. So you want to make sure that you're filling your bucket with just produce. So fruits and vegetables. You can put grains in, you can put eggshells in, coffee grounds, you know, tea, but I would take the tea bag out, things like that. You want to avoid meat products, bones, dairy, and fat. And that's because those things don't really break down in a backyard composter very well, and they can attract pests. You want to store your compost bin, find a place that works for you. I like to store mine in the freezer actually, because it keeps it's basically a bug-free way to do it. No bugs ever form when you keep your compost in the freezer, and you don't need to rely on compost liners or bags. It's actually a very clean way to do compost. You can also put it in the refrigerator, and that helps keep the ick factor down a little bit. And then some people choose to keep it on their countertop or under their sink. And those are all fine options. You just want to make sure you pay attention to that compost pretty regularly, because it can start to get a little goopy and bugs can form if you don't take it out very regularly. And then once it's all filled up, you just want to take it outside. So you're outside and you've got to choose a composter. There are a lot of different ways you can compost. There are a lot of different designs out there. You just want to think about what works best for you. You're going to have personal preferences. You're going to have certain materials available to you. So, you know, I encourage you to research all the different options that you have and think about what will best suit you. I've put 4 pictures up here of common types of composters. The number 1 is a type that is pretty sealed, Loctite shut, and it rolls on an axle. So it's a good option if you don't want to have to turn your compost with a shovel. It's also black, and that sort of raises the temperature, which is something that's important. Number 2 is a good option because it's also sealed tight, and that's good for preventing pests. And it's black, and so that raises the temperature. And it's also a model that's commonly available at municipal public works departments. So you might see that this is an easy option for you because of that. Number 3 is a good option if you are starting like a community compost bin, because it can take a lot of compost. It's a very big composter. It's also made with low or no cost materials. You've got pallets there that allow a lot of airflow, which is good. And turning the compost in that system is fairly easy because you can just sort of shovel it in and shovel it out. Number 4 is really a wire mesh cage, which can be low and no cost. That's just wrapped into a round shape, and that's good for airflow. It lets sunlight hit the whole compost pile, but it doesn't really keep pests out so much. So those are some things to think about. All compost piles need air, sun, and proper layering of browns and greens. So the sun is to help keep that temperature up. You want to make sure it stays warm so the microorganisms in the compost can do their job and break it down. You want to keep a carbon nitrogen ratio of about 30:1. And what that is your carbon are what is called browns. And so dried leaves, you know, grass clippings, things like that, horse manure, you want to mix in with your compost to help keep it balanced. Your nitrogen is the stuff that's coming from your kitchen and your food scraps. So all of that green stuff, things like fresh grass clippings are considered green. So you want to try to keep that balance between as like a 30-to-1 ratio. Keep the pile moist but not soggy, and you want to turn it weekly if you can. To get started, think about creating a pile that's about 3 by 3 by 3. So you've got these bins, and the amount of material you want, well, you'll want to fill it like that amount of space. And you want to just, when you get started, just layer those things, the browns and the greens, as evenly as possible. And then once you've kick-started it that way, then you just sort of add what you've got in your kitchen bin as the days go on. So you'll add your bin of greens, and you'll also want to add a bin of browns. And then that'll keep it balanced and even. So you can do a hands-off style of composting, and that's kind of what I do. I sort of sit it out there, I turn it as much as I can, but it's pretty hands-off and it still works. Compost though, it takes a lot of care if you want to have rich compost in a short period of time. So I'm hands-off, but I don't get compost for really less than a year. It takes about a year for that compost to finish. So you might want to think about that. If you want compost in 6 months, you'll want to pay closer attention to the amount of greens that you're adding and the temperature levels, the moisture levels. But it can be done in about 6 months if you pay attention to those things. And then finally, you know, there's just a lot of personal benefits to doing this, and that's why I'm promoting it today. You know, I live in a pay-as-you-throw community, so I have to pay for trash bags, and this is a great way for me to save money, but also benefit my community by not sending this food waste to the landfill. It also benefits the environment for the reasons we talked about earlier. It keeps my garbage can really a lot cleaner. It keeps the ick way down. You know, my garbage can is actually very clean and never smells. And then it's really nice to have a soil amendment for my garden whenever I need it. I never have to go to the store if I find a spot that's looking like it's a little hungry for some rich compost. So those are just some of the personal benefits that I see from composting. So those are the things that you can do at home, but if you are the type of person that doesn't want to be bothered with managing a compost pile, you have the option of signing up for a subscription service, and it's really good for busy families. What's also nice about these services is they can take all foods and compostable packaging because they are doing composting on an industrial scale, so they can take the bones and the meat because their piles are big enough and hot enough to decompose those things. The other great thing is you just stick it out on your curbside like you would with your regular garbage, and they'll pick it up. And then if you want, you can have them deliver finished compost. So in Maine, the places that I've identified, and there might be more, there's Scrap Dogs in the Belfast region. There's We Compost It and Garbage to Garden in the Portland region. The Mr. Fox Composting is down in New York and New Hampshire area. Pleasant River Farms is in the Bethel region. And I'm sure there are other local farms in all other parts of Maine that could take composting. So I encourage you to get in touch with them, get to know your farmer, and find out if there's a way to start a new partnership. Some towns around Maine are also taking it, and I hope to see more of that as the years go on. I know Skowhegan will take food scraps. So, you know, there's different ways to sort of manage your food waste without doing it necessarily at home. And then this is the last slide of the presentation. I just wanted to make a note about these other ways to manage your food waste if composting just doesn't work for you. There is a way of composting called vermicomposting, and that uses worms to help digest that food faster. You basically have 2 bins, one with newspaper, and you add the worms and the food and a little bit of soil. That bin sits inside another bin that is used to capture drainage, and those worms will work on your food waste for you. And you don't want to put bones or meat products in this, but it's sort of a nice, small indoor way of managing your food waste, and it's fun for kids because they get to, you know, basically feed their pet worms. And then there's aerobic and anaerobic digesters, and these things are great because they are are able to take all of those, all of the food products, but also, digest it in a way that it just basically disappears. So this green cone here, you can stick it in the ground, and because the black bottom is open, worms and other microorganisms will digest that food waste, and it'll basically leach back into the soil around it. You might have a little bit of product in there in that basket at the end, but by and large, it leaches around into the surrounding soil. And this is something that you don't have to turn. So it's a little bit like composting in as much as you're depositing your food waste into a bin outdoors, but it also just kind of goes away and you don't have to turn it. There are home anaerobic digesters, which is a little bit different than an aerobic digester. The anaerobic digester will produce a biofuel that you can actually use for cooking. So that's pretty neat too, and that produces like a fertilizer at the end of it as well. There's another method called bokashi that I recently learned about, and this is a fermenting method. And this is great for small homes where maybe you don't have a lot of yard space. Basically, you take 2 bins and you fill one with your food waste, and then you sprinkle on a bran that's been inoculated with microorganisms that ferment the food waste in that airtight container. You set it aside for 2 weeks, and then once that 2 weeks is up, you bury it in a small hole in your yard, and then it goes away. And this is a really fast method for small places. It can take only about 4 weeks to decompose all of that waste. So that is really the basics of composting at home or managing food waste at home in other ways. It's a really beautiful sunny day, so I hope you feel that you have the basic tools now to get started. And just remember that NRCM is here for you, so if you have any questions or have suggestions for resources, we are happy to help you. And we'd like to open it up now for some questions and answers.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chrissy. So now we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. Just a reminder for folks on the webinar, if you have a question for Chrissy, please type it in the Q&A box and we will get to as many questions as we can with our remaining time. So this first question comes from Vanessa, who would like you to talk a little bit about compostable packaging and what folks should be looking at before they put a bioplastic in their compost bin. Can you talk a little bit about that, Chrissy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vanessa. Thank you for bringing it up. Really going back to that hierarchy, reduce as much as you can. If you can get away without using anything that's compostable, I strongly encourage you to do that, because those compostable products don't exactly add nutrients to your compost. So you want to really sort of weigh that when you're deciding to do it. For industrial sized composting facilities, you want to keep in mind that those products don't really add that nutrient level to those facilities too. And so they'll take them, but it's not necessarily good for them. And then also keep in mind that those products, you don't really know what's in them either. They're glued together with products that sometimes have PFAS in them. So I encourage people to be very critical about what they put in their compost, especially if they're going to use that compost to grow new foods.
Great. So this next question comes from Patricia, who asks if you can add worms to a backyard composter.
Yeah, definitely. I actually added some the other day, and they might crawl around. They might not stay there. You can't really control where they'll go, but definitely add it if you have them and you want to. It's not going to be the same closed environment as a vermicomposting, but you certainly could add it if you want to.
Great. This next question comes from Elizabeth. The question is, can you give more detail about the 2 composters that are sealed? They seem to have a rat problem in their backyard, and so they're interested in sealed off composting systems.
Sure. I'll try to call out the right details. There are types of composters that you could find online. So if you're interested in buying them, I would search online, especially since we're in these COVID times. I encourage people, if you need resources for your composting bin, maybe choose an online option so that you can stay at home. But yeah, the first one was raised up off the ground and had a door that sort of sealed shut. So that might be a good option. And then the other one that sat on the ground, the black one, it is screwed into the ground. It's sort of kept down with screws so that to help keep pests out. And there's also a hook on the door that you can lock with a lock, if that helps. There's also a screw top lid, so it screws on down. So those are all the ways that those two options prevent those pests. And I encourage you, if you can't get access to one of those types of composters, maybe adding wood and on top of your exposed composter. You can add a door with hinges. Try to get creative if you can't get those options right away. With the ones that are store-bought, the black ones, for example, I've never had a problem with pests. Todd, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
So this next question comes from Michelle. She wants to know what to do with her meat and dairy waste if she can't put it in the compost bin.
So if you can't put it in a compost bin and you don't have access to a composting service, or if you don't have a farmer who could take it, unfortunately, you do need to just put it in the trash can if that's your only option, because it will attract pests and your compost won't be balanced.
Great. So this next question comes from Paula, who asks about the challenges of winter composting and how to maintain a healthy compost pile, even in the cold months here in Maine.
Yeah, it is challenging because it can kind of get frozen together. I keep mine balanced. I just try to, in the fall, make sure that I have enough browns and greens to add to my compost as time goes on throughout the winter. So, in the fall when you're raking, try to set aside enough to help keep that compost balanced. The stuff that you're adding, like as time goes on, try to mix it up when you're adding it on the spot so that while it's still a little bit warmer, you can mix it. But other than that, you just sort of have to wait till summer to sort of turn everything if it's frozen. But sometimes they're warm enough in there that you don't have to worry about that either.
Excellent. This next question comes from Thomas, who lives in Elliott, Maine. And he comments that Elliott accepts food waste for composting, but since the COVID-19 pandemic, that service has been shut down. They're also not accepting paper, plastic, or metal for recycling. He wants to know if this is a trend across Maine and if there's any guesses on when that service will return for Maine residents.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate trend that we have been seeing in a lot of places, and there isn't a really good guess that I can make as to when it'll return. I think it'll depend on when we can get up and running with good widespread testing and perhaps a vaccine. I don't know. Just pay close attention to what your municipality is talking about as far as opening, and the news about what the governor will say about opening up again. I think, if I'm very passionate about recycling, luckily, I still have access, but for a lot of people who don't, you can save, you try to store your recyclables. This is important actually for bottles, because our bottle bill program is strong when we return our bottles to a bottle redemption center. So, if you can't recycle in the normal way, try to save those things if you have the space to recycle them properly later on.
Excellent. This next question is from James. He wanted to know more about the legislation that Congresswoman Shelley Pingree was working on in DC with her colleagues to try to reduce food waste and fix date labels. Can you speak to that, Chrissy?
Well, yeah, it's sort of like I said earlier, the FDA doesn't standardize state labels with the exception of baby food. So those labels are not based on whether or not a product is good to eat or safe to eat. It's really just about quality and really coming from that sales perspective. So what Congresswoman Pingree is interested in doing is bringing some standardization and science to those labels to help people understand really what they mean, make them clearer, and make sure that people either know that it doesn't have to do with food safety, or add a label that makes it clear that it's about safety, and make the language standardized. So choosing a few choice phrases that are standard across the country.
Great. So a couple questions here about what we can and cannot put in our compost bins. One question is, if food is moldy, can we still put it in our compost bin? And then another question is, can we put onion peels, citrus peels, and garlic in our compost bin? So there's some questions about what we can and can't put in our compost.
Sure. I put citrus and onion and moldy foods in my compost, but again, I'm sort of a low maintenance composter. I just do it because I want to divert the food waste, and at the end of the day, I get a little bit of compost, and it's not perfect compost, but I get some. If you want really perfect compost, you might think twice about putting those things in because they don't break down that easily. It's true that like an avocado peel or a lemon peel, it's going to be in there a long time. If you do want to put it in there, you can chop it up finely, and that might help the digestion a little bit. It's really up to you and the kind of compost you want. There are a lot of great resources at our local libraries and on the internet if you want to know more about sort of getting into the weeds and the real science of creating a compost pile. But by and large, my attitude is, if I can divert that food waste, it's okay for me if my compost is a little chunky, because I'm okay with that, and it's diverting the food waste. But so whether you can or can't is really up to you and your personal preference, but knowing that those particular foods don't really break down as fast.
Great. So we have a few more minutes for questions. Again, if folks have questions, please type them in the question and answer box, and we will try to get to them. This next question comes from Elizabeth, who asks, how large a compost pile do you need to be able to digest meat and other products? What does the internal temperature need to be?
Oh, that's a really good question. It needs to be pretty high, and it needs to be pretty big. I am a vegetarian, so I've never actually had to do it myself, but I don't know the exact answer to that. I think if you were interested, going to your local library, maybe looking at the resources there, or just calling one of those companies that I listed before, they would probably be able to provide you some good answers about that. I've never seen a small pile that digests meat. I've only seen those really big ones, and I would be nervous about doing it in my own backyard because of the pest factor. But I think, the temperature does need to be pretty high, and I think you do need to be turning it pretty regularly. So keep those things in mind when you're doing it. But if you're comfortable, you could always experiment too. There's a lot of local conditions that make a compost successful or not. So, if you want to try it, if you have the space and if you have the willpower, try to do it. It would need to be bigger than those home composters you saw pictures of earlier.
Excellent. A quick comment from Katrina, who notes that Mark King at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, who is the state's compost guru, would be a helpful resource for anyone who has questions about meat or dairy or other backyard composting questions. So Mark King at Maine DEP is a real expert there.
Yeah, he is actually very good. And there are a lot of resources on DEP's website about composting, and Mark started the Maine Compost School. So he's very much into the science. If you want to get it down to a science and have perfect compost, he's a great resource.
Great. This next question comes from Liz, who asks about dog waste. She's wondering if dog waste in a compostable bag can go into a municipal compost pile. I'm not quite sure with municipal compost whether she means a curbside compost service or in a backyard composter, but what about pet waste?
Yeah, don't put your pet waste in with your regular compost. If you want to compost pet waste, it's doable. And actually, we have a pet card on our what to do with pet waste card as a resource available to you. So if you want a hard copy, please get in touch and we'll get that to you. But you want to set up, if you want to do it at home, you want to set up a separate digester. So the cone that is buried in the ground where the waste can leach away and microorganisms can manage that waste for you. That's really the safest way to do pet waste. Don't put pet waste in with your regular compost and don't put it in with your vegetable garden. And really, I wouldn't even put it in with your flower gardens if you and your family like to sort of work with your flowers. If you have a little bit of leftover from that digester that's underground, put it in a place that isn't really going to be where people aren't really going to be interacting with it, because you can use natural processes to manage it, but it's not necessarily going to always be safe. So you just need to be careful.
Great. This next question relates to the current public health crisis that we're experiencing. She asked, during this crisis, is it safe to transport compost items to a family's backyard composter? She keeps them in a plastic container under the sink that is closed tightly. So I'm really just wondering if it's safe to transport compost to a family member's backyard compost bucket.
I would imagine so, but just make sure you take the proper precautions. Wear your mask, wash your hands, make sure you keep your distance from those folks. And if you think your hands are going to touch that compost, make sure you wear gloves and just take those proper precautions. I think you should be okay if you are just sort of dropping it off or depositing it in a neighbor's yard.
Great. So this is the last question that we'll have time for this morning. This is from Peter, who says that he has a barrel type backyard composter, and he's wondering how much carbon to add to his composter. He says if he has a 1 gallon pail of greens, how much carbon should he add to that 1 gallon?
So once your compost has really been kickstarted and going, you can add equal parts. It's just sort of in the beginning when you're kickstarting it that you want to have that high ratio, and then you want to add sort of equal parts as you go. The best way to actually tell, though, if your compost needs more carbon is by smell. If it smells like garbage, if it smells kind of icky, it has that kind of moldy smell, that means that there's too much nitrogen. So, think about the smell, and that should help guide you in when adding that extra carbon. You can't, it's kind of hard to add too much carbon, in my opinion. I've really crammed my composter with a lot of leaves before, and so long as you turn it, and so long as you're adding a bucket a day, you can still get good soil out the bottom. But again, I like a low maintenance composter. But if you want that high maintenance or that high quality soil, try to measure it. Try to add those greens and browns in an equal way.
Excellent, great. This is the end of our webinar this morning. Many thanks to Chrissy for her excellent presentation, and to you all for joining us. Just a couple of closing comments here. So this webinar this morning was part of NRCM's Earth Week webinar series. That series continues tomorrow with a webinar about clean transportation solutions that can help fight climate change here in Maine. That is from 11 a.m. to 12 noon, and you can sign up for that webinar on our website, nrcm.org. And there's lots more resources about food waste and composting also on our website at nrcm.org. So if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to Chrissy. Her contact information is right on the screen there, or visit our website at nrcm.org. Thanks again for joining us this morning, and have a happy rest of your afternoon. Take care, everybody.